I have spent thousands of dollars on courses and mentorship programs to understand how to put my money into good investment properties that not only provides appreciation but also cash flow. And I am going to discuss all that and more in today's video, so let's get started. First, we'll be talking about that there are only two reasons why you should buy an investment property, and then we'll be talking about how to analyze cash flow, and those are the only two things that we'll be talking about in today's presentation. So first, let's discuss two reasons to buy. Number one is you buy for appreciation, and number two is you buy for cash flow. What I mean by buying for appreciation is that when you buy a property at a certain price, in due time, it increases in value and then you sell, and that's buying for appreciation. And most times, a lot of investors would not look at cash flow that much, especially in markets like Ontario and BC, where cash flow is difficult. And the second one is self-explanatory. You buy for cash flow, which means that irrespective of how much the property is appreciating, every single month, after you deduct expenses from your income, which is your gross rents, you make a profit and you have positive cash flow. Now let's look at an example of buying for appreciation, and this is the most common example that you see in pre-construction. So I have a friend who bought his investment property in Kitchener. It was a one-bedroom condo in February 2018 for $279,000. It's absolutely unbelievable that the prices in Kitchener were that low back in 2018 and 2019, but that's the number that he bought it at. And he put down 10%, which is $28,000 roughly, and $7,000 in upgrades. So his upfront investment was about $35,000 that he had to give in the first 3 to 6 months of acquiring this pre-construction. The possession for this house was in 2021, December of 2021. This was very close to the peak of the market, and the same condo was now costing $480,000. And there was a free assignment when he bought this condo, and therefore he said that I'll actually flip this on an assignment sale. His gross proceeds were, of course, $480,000 minus $279,000, which is $201,000. His net proceeds after the realtor charges, the lawyer charges, the assignment, there are certain costs associated, when you're doing an assignment sale. After everything, it was $175,000. And because this is capital gains, after paying the capital gain taxes, this is not profit because he had put $35,000 upfront. So this is basically gross proceeds after tax is $141,250. This is a crazy 300+% return, which comes out to, for 4 years, 42% year-on-year return. That's unbelievable. And this was very common when the market was doing very well, and therefore a lot of investors, and by extension the realtors who are selling these investment properties, also feel that this is the best way of making money when you're buying real estate. But this all changed in the last few years, and I'll give you another example. This is also a live example. I'll not take names or anything here, but this one was bought for $900,000 at almost the peak of the market, May of 2022. It's a townhouse. It's a pre-construction, again in Kitchener. And then the upfront cost was, of course, 10%, which is $90,000. And then on possession, they had to pay another 10%. This was an investment property. This was not something that the person was buying for themselves. And what happened in October of 2023 is that the same house is actually not worth the same. The same house is worth $80,000 lower, and therefore that means that they cannot sell the house on assignment. There was an assignment clause in this one as well, but they cannot sell on assignment because who would buy an $820,000 house at over $900,000, and therefore they can't sell the house. Now obviously they have to get a mortgage or sell at a loss, and if they go and get a mortgage, the appraisal will come in at $820,000, which means that they are short by $80,000 on cash. So over and above the 20% that they had to pay, they also need to shell out more money because the appraisal came in low. And let's say they close this property, the cash flow on this house will be minus $1,500 because the interest rates are so high. So the same example that we took in the last presentation, if the timelines change, it's actually a recipe for disaster. And the reason is that people always feel that the market goes up, but what they forget to mention is that the market always goes up in long term. And when I say long term, it's 8 to 15 years. It's not 2 to 3 years. The market goes up long term, but short term, you never know. Now let's look at another example, which is a live example. 3 days ago, I got a call from someone who said that I'm getting a new built townhome in a really nice neighborhood in Calgary for $477,000, and they were contemplating doing the deposit on that. There was a rental guarantee, which actually lured them a lot. It's $2,500 a month, and they were like, there's no way that we'll not get any rentals or we'll not find any tenants, and therefore, they wanted to do this. We'll talk about that in a bit as well. And there was a free assignment clause. So if they are not able to close this property for some reason, they can actually sell it and make a profit, just like we saw in the first example. And there was only a 5% deposit, which is $23,850. So all this looked amazing until we actually ran the numbers on this. The down payment on this one will be about $95,000. The closing cost in Alberta, and that's why I love Alberta, is because there's no closing cost at all. The only fee that you pay is the lawyer fee. That's $2,000. There's no land transfer tax there. The mortgage amount will be $381,600, and because the interest rates are very high, I've done this calculation at 6.5% interest rate. The mortgage payment will come out to be about $2,400, and property taxes, strata fee, because it's a townhome, but it's not a freehold townhome, and therefore there's a small strata fee of $400 as well. Insurance, you have to pay insurance even if you are putting this on rent, and property manager fee, because this person was based in Ontario, you need a property manager to manage the tenants and everything there. All this comes out to a total expense of $3,165, and the rental guarantee that you saw was $2,500. Now let me just talk about the rental guarantee and why I feel it's absolutely misleading when people say that, oh, there's a rental guarantee and therefore it's amazing. Now let me explain this rental guarantee a little bit. Let's say you get a rental guarantee of $2,500. If you are to rent out a townhome, this is a 3-bedroom, 2.5-bath townhome in a really nice neighborhood, you would get from anywhere between $2,400 to $2,700 if you are to rent out today. So them giving a $2,500 rental guarantee next year for the next 3 years actually doesn't cut anything, because there's no rent control in Calgary. That means that next year, the same townhome which is renting for $2,500 today will be renting for about $2,700 to $2,800, and the year after that will be over $3,000, and the only person who is losing with the rental guarantee is you and me, not the builder. So wherever you see a rental guarantee, the catch is that it's not adjusting for inflation, it's not adjusting for the rent increase that we can anticipate in the next couple of years. And honestly, in Alberta, with the amount of people who have come there, there's absolutely no reason to believe that you'll not be able to put your house on rent. So looking at the expenses and the rental guarantee of $2,500, the cash flow becomes $665 negative. So you actually lose money on this. Now let's talk about the free assignment that we are talking about here. This is only 1 year possession, right? So if you buy this house now, you will get it in 1 year, and let's say the property price increases by 10%. Now I don't think that in the next 1 year the property price can increase 10%. Yes, it has done in the last 2 years, but we are going into a recession and there will be some impact. But let's take very optimistic estimates here and say that the property value has increased by 10% to $525,000, which is an increase. Or if you were to sell it on assignment, which is a free assignment, you get a gross proceeds of $48,000, which is not a lot, honestly. But in context to you only spend $23,850, you have almost doubled your money. However, these are gross proceeds. So you need to look at the net proceeds, which includes the realtor fee and the lawyer fee as well. You only end up with about $32,000. So $23,000 slashed down to $32,000. However, you also need to pay tax on this. And after paying tax on this, you will be down to about $25,000 of after-tax proceeds, which is a whopping $337 of appreciation if you sell this house in 1 year on assignment. Therefore, having a free assignment on this particular house is a moot point. Just to give you some context on $337, this is only 1.4% return. If you put this same money of $23,850 into your EQ Bank GIC for 1 year, you'll actually get a much bigger return of $1,347, and you really don't have to get into hassle of buying a house and selling a house and making less than half the profit. This particular situation is a perfect win-lose, and the only person who is losing here is you, who is buying this particular house. The realtor makes upwards of $15,000 on this transaction. The mortgage agent makes upwards of $5,000 on this transaction. The builder makes I don't know how much money on this transaction, and even if they give a rental guarantee, they make more cash flow than you. So whenever you see freebies thrown into a pre-construction deal, ask yourself this: what's the cash? Do the numbers and then make a decision. In my view, buying for appreciation is like playing a roulette. If you have played the game of roulette, you have black and white. If you put your money on black and the red turns up, you have a 48.6% chance of winning, because there's a 0 in the game as well, and the house has more odds of winning. The same way in pre-construction, or when you're buying for appreciation a new house, there's more than a 50% chance that you'll actually not win, because the only thing that you can control is where you are putting the money, the location, but you cannot control the market. You cannot control what US does. You cannot control what Russia and Ukraine do. You just cannot control so many of these short-term external factors that might impact the real estate market in Canada and across the world. I told you that I spent so much money on understanding this, but what I've understood about negative cash flow is that when you have negative cash flow coming from a property, you are working for that asset instead of that asset working for you, and that's not fair. Now, even though my examples were all pre-construction, but that doesn't hold true for only pre-construction. Even if you are buying a resale house, but you are okay with the negative cash flow, always remember this line, because if you lose your job, you have to make up for that $800, $900, $1,000 of negative cash flow. That means that you have to work to to maintain that property. Otherwise, you'll have to sell that property or it goes into foreclosure. And that means that you are working for that property instead of that property giving you money, that property making you rich, that property working for you. Now that we know that buying for appreciation is not always the smartest decision, now let's understand what cash flow means. And cash flow in simple terms is income minus expenses. But a lot of people feel that it's only rent minus mortgage, and that's absolutely not the case. To understand cash flow a little bit better, let's go to my Excel that I use for me and my clients when I'm investing into real estate. So let me explain this Excel a little bit because it can be a little bit overwhelming, but I'll go step by step and hopefully I'll be able to simplify it. So let's say you're analyzing 5 or 6 or 7 different options when you are looking for cash flow. So these are house number 1, house number 2, house number 3, and then the purchase value. Now I've just taken dummy numbers here, but let me just explain all these terms by only taking one property here. So purchase price of $450,000. Let's say that's the case. If this is an investment property, therefore $90,000 will be the down payment, which is about 20% down payment. The closing cost, because this is Alberta, it will be very less. But if you're buying in Ontario, it will at least be 2.5% of the purchase price. So you need to budget a little bit more as closing cost. And then setup cost means that either you're doing an Airbnb, so you need furniture, or you're renovating the property and you need a little bit money upfront. Now I've taken $40,000. I explained to you, this was actually an example that I have in the presentation going forward as well. But let's say your upfront cost was anywhere between $100,000 to $130,000 depending on whether it requires renovations or not. So the loan that you're taking is about $360,000, and the mortgage on that loan at 7% because interest rates are very high. Don't take any conservative estimates right now. At 7%, 30-year amortization is 2371. And the way to get this is I have actually linked here, and this Excel, by the way, you can actually download from the website. I'll put the link in the description below, but you can actually go to this particular link. This is basically a BMO calculator, and you put in all the details of the loan value, the purchase price, the interest rate, amortization of 30 years, and you'll get this number of 2371. Around 20 to 25% is going towards principal payments. Interest payments are the rest. So you are paying a lot more interest because the interest rate is obviously very high. You then input property taxes, which are really important. A lot of people miss that. Then you put condo strata fee. If there's no strata fee, then it's $0. You also put insurance because you're buying a rental property. Let's say there are 2 tenants. The insurance will be over $100. My insurance for my Calgary house is about $130. So let's say it's $125. Then are you paying the utilities or are the tenants paying the utilities? Let's say the tenants are paying the utilities. So you take $0 here. The vacancy is another thing that you need to take. Now vacancy basically means that let's say in 2 years, you have 1 month where the tenants are actually not paying, or you use that time to renovate the house, or for any reason, the rent did not come up, to what it should actually be. And therefore you take a 3% vacancy, which is an average in Calgary in good neighborhoods right now. You can take a little bit more if you want to be more conservative, but I've taken 3% here. And the vacancy is calculated 3% of the rents. So let's say the rents are $4,000. 3% of that is $120. All this is automated. So just, this sheet is very rough, but make sure that you are not touching these automations or else you just download it again. The property management, if you are out of town, let's say this is Calgary and you are in Ontario or BC, you need a property manager, and that will be about 8 to 10%. I've taken 8%, which I pay for my property. Maintenance, because it's a rental property, something can break and you are responsible for that breakage, at least the cost of it. So let's say $100 a month. If it's a newer property, you can take $50 a month. If it's a older property, let's say $100 a month. And your net operating expenses, which is all the expenses other than the mortgage payment that you are doing, will be $915. So these are basically all the expenses other than the mortgage payment. And that's something that a lot of new investors miss. I missed it for the first time. I thought it was rent minus my mortgage, but that's not the case. You have over $900 of expenses in this particular example. So total expenses come to mortgage plus this net operating expense, which is $3286. And let's say you're getting a $4,000 of rent, and therefore you're making a net income or cash flow of $714. Now, there are a lot of people who would invest into negative cash flow properties as well. Now, sometimes they're actually doing a bigger down payment to reduce their negative cash flow, while some other times they are doing something called as profit over expenses. What this basically means is the principal portion of your mortgage payment is actually the money that you are putting from one pocket to another. That's yours. So let's say in the second example, you have a negative cash flow of $434, but if you add your principal payment to this negative cash flow, because your principal payment is not really an expense, it's something that you own because that's your equity, you still get a positive number, which is profit over expenses. Again, this is if you add your principal payment to your negative cash flow. This number has to be absolutely positive. If this number is negative, there's no upside to this property and you should absolutely not look to buy this. But if this number is positive, then you can still consider, because there is future potential in this property and there are other factors that you need to consider. But that's how most savvy investors would compare properties and then make a decision based on numbers and not emotion. Now, I get this a lot from my clients, that what if I need both cash flow and appreciation? And that's the sweet spot that everyone requires. That's the holy grail of real estate. And I actually made a video on how to do that in a much more riskier way. You can buy, rezone. It's called infills, buy, rezone, demolish and build. Do check that video out. I'll link that in the description below. Even though that's a situation where you are actually flipping an old property into, rezoning it into 4 different townhouses and selling it. And it's almost like a flip that you are making within 1 to 2 years. But you can also potentially rent this renovated house, or, converting the single family into 4 units and still make a profit. But that's a more risky way of doing it. And therefore, I would not recommend, if you are a new investor, you do it all on your own. You either partner with someone who has already done it, or you do it in partnership with more investors so that your risk is diversified. But let's talk about a more conservative way of achieving both appreciation and cash flow in a property. These are 2 old properties that I just got off the MLS, and these are 1980s built, so they are pretty old. The first property is, the purchase price will be about $390,000. It requires a lot of renovations. The upstairs is about 4 bedroom, 2 bath. Basement is completely unfinished, but it's an 800 square feet basement with all the rough-ins, so you can actually renovate this. The reno's budget will be about $80,000, but because it requires a lot of work, not just the basement, but upstairs also. The flooring needs to change, the kitchen needs to be renovated. So overall, the renovations cost will be slightly higher on this one, so it will be about $80,000, and the expected rent that you get after spending $390 on the purchase plus $80,000 on the renos will be about $3,800. So it's pretty decent, but the upfront cost is pretty high on this one. Let's take a similar property. It's also a detached house, 1981 built, I think, if my memory serves me right. The purchase price is about $450,000, but the difference is that the upstairs is 3 bed, 2 bath. It's bigger than this, even though it has 1 less bed. A lot of old houses actually, are pretty big from inside, and it's also renovated, a lot better. Upstairs, you actually need to do nothing. Maximum that you'll have to do is paint the house upstairs. And the basement is also finished. It's a 900 square feet finished basement, but it doesn't have a kitchen and it doesn't have a bifurcation between the living room and the bedroom. So you just need to, maybe to get permits to, build that bedroom, and you need to build the kitchen. But all the windows, everything else is, pretty good. And it's actually, they have legal permits to build a legal unit downstairs as well. The reno cost, because it's pretty renovated, you just need to build a kitchen. On the high side would be about $40,000. And after you do, purchase this house, plus you do the renovations, you can actually rent out upstairs and downstairs for a total of $4,000. So in my view, between these 2 properties, looking at the upfront cost that you need to put down, even though, you'll probably purchase the first one a little bit cheaper, I would still go for this. Now let's analyze the numbers. It's not just about, looking at these numbers and saying, oh, there's a potential and therefore I should buy it. So let's say today you purchase this for $450,000. Your down payment is 20% again, $90,000. The closing cost is about $2,000 because again, this is Calgary and therefore you don't have to pay any land transfer taxes. The renovations is $40,000. The holding cost, and that's something that a lot of investors miss, is when you're renovating the house, you cannot rent it out. And therefore the $3,000 of your expenses for the next 2 months, which are being used for renovations, you'll have to include that as upfront costs. No one is going to pay for it, right? And you still have to, pay the bank, the mortgage. So the cash upfront, including all these expenses, and the down payment will be $138,000. And the mortgage at 7% will be 2,371, and the net operating expenses, and again, you can use the Excel that you can download from my website to do these net operating expenses. The Excel that we just discussed will be about $900, and the total expenses will be 3,264. And the rent that you get is about $4,000. So you make a cash flow of $714, and my maths is a little bit wrong here, but yeah, upwards of $700 of cash flow in this particular property. In year 2, let's assume, because there's no rent control in Calgary, the rent increases by 5%. Now the rents have increased by crazy 10 to 15% in the last 2 years. But let's take a more conservative, you should always do conservative estimates. Let's assume that year 2, rent is about $4,200. Your cash flow increases to about $900. Year 3, it's increased by another $250. Your cash flow increases to over $1,100. And you are amazing. Why? Because you also forced appreciation in this house. The $450,000 that you bought it at, the $40,000 of renovations that you made to make the lower unit, legal and rentable, you not only increase the price to $490, but a similar house right now, not 2 years in the future, right now is selling for $580,000, and therefore you forced $90,000 of appreciation by making the lower unit rentable. This sounds like a lot of work, but in this example, not only did you appreciate your property by $90,000, but you're also making cash flow from month one. Now, this is not my favorite thing to do in the world, but sometimes it's not the worst idea to borrow the renovations cost of $40,000 from your line of credit. And I'll explain to you how you pay that back in a couple of years. But let's say you borrowed the renovation cost, of $40,000 from your unsecured line of credits that you get from the bank at 12% interest rate, even though it's much less right now. But it's 12%, let's say, the interest rate. Your interest for every single month, not your principal payment inclusive here, only the interest will be about $400 a month. So even if you're paying that interest and include that in your cost, net operating expenses, you'll still make a cash flow of over $300 in month one. Now let's fast forward 2 years from now, and let's say your outstanding balance now, instead of $360,000, which was the starting balance, in 2 years you'll actually pay down your mortgage, or the tenant will pay down the mortgage. And let's say the outstanding balance is $350,000 plus, remember, you have the $40,000 of line of credit. For all these 2 years you have been paying $400 a month in interest. So let's assume that line of credit is still there. But the new value of the house is $600,000. I've assumed almost zero appreciation in 2 years because it might happen that it doesn't appreciate or it goes down. But let's assume zero appreciation. This is all the appreciation that you created in your property. And let's assume in 2 years it only appreciated another $20,000, which is a very conservative estimate that I'm taking. But yeah, it's completely possible. The new loan that the bank will give if you qualify will be $480,000. So how the bank see this is that if the value of the house is $600,000, you can borrow 80% against that $600,000, which is $480,000. And now the interest rates hopefully have come down to, let's say, 5%. Now, I think the interest rates will probably come down a little bit lower than 5%. It will be closer to 4%. But let's assume, again, do conservative estimates because we don't know what's going to happen. After all this, you can get a new loan of $480,000. You owe the banks, because you have a line of credit plus the previous bank that you hold the mortgage with, of $390,000. After paying all this, you are left with $90,000 that come into your bank account that can be a seed money for your investment number 2. All this is good, but we also need to make sure that if you're doing an equity takeout, the cash flow still makes sense. We still need to cash flow after taking out almost $100,000 from this house and increasing our mortgage on this. So the mortgage payment at 5% will not be very different from what it was at $360,000 because now the interest rates are lower. The net operating expenses are $1,200. I've just increased that because we are in an inflationary situation. Total expenses move up to about $3,762. Your rent in year 3, like we said in the last slide, will be $4,450. So you still make a cash flow of $700. Year 4 will be even higher cash flow, and year 5 will be even more cash flow, and you still end up with $1,100 of cash flow. And you can repeat this or not, pay down the mortgage and set yourself up for a really nice retirement in 20 to 30 years when the tenants pay this house down and you still get $7,000 to $8,000 of rent from this. Now, I know I used a lot of numbers and it could have gotten a little bit complicated in me explaining that it's still possible to put a little bit of work in your property and achieve appreciation with cash flow, and know that a lot of good investors continue to do this even in a bad market. And like I explained earlier, there's very little upside in doing that in today's market. I know this video has been very long, but one last slide before we close this presentation. Investing is not for everyone. And the reason is that we need to ask these questions to us. What if the tenant doesn't pay? And it's a very real possibility. In Canada, the landlord-tenant board, even in Calgary, is not in favor of the landlords. And therefore, if the tenants don't pay, you need to be prepared for that. What if something breaks? What if the roof breaks? What if the furnace breaks? So these are 2 risks that you can actually solve by doing 2 things. And all good investors would do that. You need to distribute your risk. Either buy in partnership with someone so that if there's a loss, you can actually just distribute that loss amongst the 2. If there's a profit, good. You make less profit, but it's at least your risk is distributed. Or you buy an up and down duplex like, I did in Calgary. Because if the upstairs person doesn't pay rent, that doesn't necessarily mean that the downstairs person or, both the people will not be paying rent at the same time. And therefore, you just distribute your risk, not just by partnering with someone and splitting your profits and losses, but also by making sure that you have 2 rents coming from up and down so that if one person doesn't pay, you still get something and you're able to salvage something out of your mortgage. And the second thing that you should absolutely do is have an emergency fund. And this is not the emergency fund that you have in your personal life. This is an emergency fund for this particular investment property. So when I bought our Calgary house, We kept $10,000 in our common account with our partners. Why? Because if there's a contingency that happens, if something breaks, if the tenant doesn't pay, we don't have to tap into our personal lives to pull that money out and fund that. And therefore, we actually kept about 3 months of expenses, which was about $3,000 roughly at that time, into that account so that it just pays for any contingency that we have. And the third very real problem, and a lot of people say that what if the market crashes? And that's the reason why you actually do all the dance that we did in the previous slide. You force appreciation into the property so that if the market crashes by 10%, you actually improve the property and therefore improve the value of the house by 10% and hence did not lose money because of the crash. And the second one is that you don't actually have to sell in a crash, because the property is making cash flow till the time market actually grows, and in long term you're able to sell for appreciation as well. In the meantime, you make a lot of cash flow and live a really good life, and this asset pays for you, not the other way around. I know it sounds like a lot of work, but that's what it takes to be a really good investor. And yes, it's difficult, but it will be a lot easier if you surround yourself with a team that's working for you, a good realtor, a good lawyer, a good mortgage agent. Book a call from the description below and I'll set you up with a really good realtor who will get you a property like this, and we can work out the mortgage numbers between us. And in the meantime, you get to learn firsthand how to invest in a really good property and get cash flow as well as appreciation, and then you can actually repeat that on your own in a couple of years time. That's all I have for today. मिलते हैं अगली वीडियो में, तब तक के लिए बाय बाय।